There is a canyon in the American Southwest so vast, so impossibly deep, that the first Europeans who stood at its rim in 1540 simply turned around and walked away. They had been sent by the Spanish crown to find a river. What they found instead was a wound in the earth so enormous it seemed less like a geographical feature and more like a scar left behind by something ancient and unknowable. They stared into it for 3 days. They sent a small group of men down into it. Those men climbed back up, shaken and silent, and reported that what had looked like small boulders from the rim were actually taller than the greatest towers in all of Spain. Then the entire expedition turned their horses around and never came back. That is the official story. That is the version written in the textbooks, taught in the classrooms, repeated in the travel brochures that call the Grand Canyon one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. And it is not wrong, exactly. But it is remarkably, almost suspiciously, incomplete. Because here is what the textbooks do not mention. Long before those Spanish soldiers arrived, long before Christopher Columbus drew his first map of the New World, long before any European power had assembled the ships or the courage to cross the Atlantic Ocean, there is a possibility, a strange, stubborn, evidence-backed possibility that someone else had already been there, not stumbled there, not passed through accidentally, but arrived with purpose, with knowledge, with the organizational precision of a civilization that had already conquered most of the known world. The Romans. Let that sit for a moment. The same civilization that built the Colosseum, engineered aqueducts that carried water across mountains, established trade routes that stretched from Britain to the borders of China, that civilization. The question being asked by a small but serious collection of researchers, archaeologists, and historians is not whether Romans were curious enough or capable enough to have crossed the Atlantic. The question, and this is where it becomes genuinely unsettling, is whether they actually did, and whether certain people in certain positions of authority have spent a very long time making sure that question never received a proper answer. This is not a story about conspiracy theories decorated with dramatic music. This is a story about evidence, about artifacts pulled from American soil that carry unmistakable Roman fingerprints, about symbols carved into canyon walls that do not belong to any known indigenous culture of the region, about a 1909 newspaper article that described a discovery so extraordinary that the Smithsonian Institution was immediately involved, and then the discovery was never mentioned again, about archives that were catalogued, sealed, and quietly removed from public access, about the strange and repeated pattern of official institutions receiving reports of Roman-era objects found on American soil and responding not with excitement, but with silence. Every civilization that rises to the heights Rome once reached shares one particular obsession. It is not gold, though they want gold. It is not power, though they crave power. It is not even territory, though they will bleed endlessly for territory. The deepest obsession of every great empire is the horizon, the thing that lies just beyond what is known. The Romans called it the edge of the world, and they could not leave it alone. By the height of the Roman Empire, around the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Rome already knew things that would not be rediscovered for another 1,000 years. Roman engineers calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. Roman geographers wrote seriously about landmasses beyond the Great Western Ocean. Roman sailors, the ones whose stories were recorded not in official histories but in the margins of manuscripts and the cargo logs of trading vessels, spoke of currents in the Atlantic that could carry a ship westward without effort if the captain simply had the patience to let the sea do the work. The Romans were not mythologizers in the way we sometimes imagine ancient people. They were administrators, accountants, military strategists. When a Roman general sent soldiers somewhere, he wanted a report. When a Roman merchant sent ships somewhere, he wanted a ledger. When a Roman emperor ordered an expedition, he expected documentation. He expected maps. He expected inventories of resources, of peoples encountered, of routes charted. This is important, because it means that if the Romans did reach the Americas, if they did stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon, or navigate the Colorado River through its impossible stone corridor, they would have written it down. And if someone later chose to make that writing disappear, they would have needed a very good reason. The story you are about to hear has been assembled from fragments, from the careful work of researchers who were laughed out of academic conferences and then quietly proven right about smaller things, from the analysis of artifacts that official institutions dated, catalogued, and then lost, from indigenous oral traditions that describe visitors who do not match any known pre-Columbian contact culture, from the geology of the Grand Canyon itself, which contains layers of human history so compressed and so ancient that even mainstream archaeologists admit there are chapters of the American story that remain completely unread. It begins, as all the most interesting stories do, not with an answer, but with a question asked by the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong place. It begins in 1909, in a dusty Arizona newspaper office, when a man named G. E. Kinkaid sat down and told a story that should have changed everything, a story about tunnels, about chambers carved into the canyon walls hundreds of feet above the river, about artifacts so foreign to the American Southwest that the man who found them immediately thought of Egypt, of Rome, of the ancient Mediterranean world, about a discovery that the Smithsonian Institution confirmed, investigated, and then erased from every official record it possessed. But before we descend into those tunnels, before we follow the evidence down into the red stone corridors of one of the most mysterious places on Earth, we need to understand the world that produced the people who may have walked there first. We need to understand Rome. Not the Rome of gladiators and emperors that Hollywood has made so familiar it feels like furniture. The real Rome. The restless, calculating, obsessively expansionist civilization that looked at every horizon and saw not a boundary, but an invitation. Because the most important thing to understand about the Romans is this: they never stopped. They never reached a border and said, "This is enough." Every wall they built was simultaneously a fortification and a launching point. Every sea they mastered became the surface across which they looked for the next one. And the Atlantic Ocean, the great dark water that ancient writers called the Sea of Darkness and the Ocean of Storms, was not a wall to the Roman mind. It was a door, and some of them, it appears, may have opened it. What follows is not a comfortable story. It will not leave you with the clean satisfaction of a mystery neatly solved. What it will do is show you the evidence, layer by layer, piece by piece. The way a geologist reads a canyon wall, finding in each stratum a different chapter of a story far older and far stranger than anything written on the surface. And by the time you reach the bottom of it, you will understand why certain archives were deleted, why certain discoveries were buried, and why the Grand Canyon, the place Americans are told is simply a beautiful hole in the ground, may be one of the most archaeologically significant and deliberately misrepresented places in the entire world. The story starts with a river. It always starts with a river. Rome did not become the greatest empire in the ancient world by accident. It became that empire through a combination of military genius, administrative ruthlessness, and a quality that is far less often celebrated, but perhaps more important than either of those things: curiosity. Roman curiosity was not the gentle, philosophical curiosity of the Greeks who came before them. It was the sharp, purposeful curiosity of a civilization that understood knowledge as power and power as survival. When the Romans wanted to know something, they did not simply wonder about it. They sent someone to find out. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome had already done things that would not be repeated for 1,000 years after its collapse. Roman engineers had constructed roads so perfectly engineered that some of them are still visible today beneath the asphalt of modern European highways. Roman aqueducts carried fresh water across distances of 60 miles or more, defying gravity through a precise understanding of hydraulic pressure that would not be formally rediscovered until the Renaissance. Roman trade networks connected the empire to India, to China through Persian intermediaries, to sub-Saharan Africa through routes that moved gold, ivory, and exotic animals northward in quantities that modern economists find genuinely staggering. The point is not that Rome was impressive. Everyone knows Rome was impressive. The point is that Rome was connected. It sat at the center of a web of information that stretched across the entire known world, and every new thread of that web brought back knowledge that fed back into the machine, making Rome more capable, more expansive, more hungry. And the Romans knew about the Atlantic. They had known about it for a long time. The Greek geographer Strabo, whose work was widely read and debated in Roman intellectual circles, wrote seriously about the possibility of crossing the Western Ocean to reach unknown lands. The philosopher Seneca, who was tutor to the Emperor Nero and one of the most educated men alive in the 1st century, wrote a passage in his play Medea that has haunted scholars for centuries. He wrote that the time would come when the ocean would loosen the chains of the world, when a great land would be opened up, and when a new sailor would discover new worlds. Written roughly 1500 years before Columbus set sail. Written by a man who had access to the private libraries of emperors. Was Seneca merely being poetic? Perhaps. But there is a distinction worth drawing between a poet imagining something beautiful and an educated man with access to classified geographical knowledge making a specific prediction. Seneca was many things, but vague was not among them. The Roman navy, by the height of the empire, was a formidable instrument. Roman warships called Liburnians were fast, maneuverable, and capable of extended ocean travel. Roman merchant vessels, the broad-bellied cargo ships called corrita and corbita, regularly crossed open water on routes between North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, between Spain and Britain, between the Mediterranean ports and the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands, which sit roughly 1,000 miles off the coast of West Africa, directly at the point where Atlantic trade winds curve westward and southward, forming a natural highway that ocean currents carry, with extraordinary reliability, directly toward the Caribbean. This is not speculation. This is the same route, the same wind system, the same current that Christopher Columbus followed in 1492. He did not discover it. He learned it, some historians believe, from Portuguese sailors who had been quietly exploring westward currents for decades before his famous voyage. And those Portuguese sailors did not necessarily discover it either, because the Romans were on the Canary Islands for centuries, using them as a waypoint in their western Atlantic trade, and any Roman sailor, with a sharp eye and a willingness to keep sailing past the edge of comfort, would have felt those same westward currents pulling at his hull. Now, add something else to this picture, something that most mainstream history courses do not include in their curriculum. In 1976, a marine archaeologist named Robert Marks was diving off the coast of Guanabara Bay in Brazil. What he found on the seafloor was a collection of ceramic amphora fragments, the distinctive two-handled clay storage jars that Romans used to transport wine, olive oil, and other goods across the Mediterranean. The amphoras were identified by multiple experts as being consistent with Roman production from the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. The Brazilian government, immediately upon being informed of this discovery, closed the dive site. Officially, the reason given was environmental protection. The site has remained closed to independent research ever since. Let that fact live in your mind for a moment before we continue. The question of whether Romans could have crossed the Atlantic is actually, when examined honestly, not the difficult question it is sometimes presented as. The difficult question, the one with genuine weight, is why they would have. What would have driven a Roman expedition to leave the known world, cross 3,000 miles of open ocean, and arrive on a continent they had no name for? The answer, when you understand how the Roman imperial system actually functioned, is straightforward. Resources, routes, glory, all three of which the Roman state was perpetually in search of, and all three of which a new, unexplored landmass would have offered in almost incomprehensible abundance. There is also a military dimension that is rarely discussed. By the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, Rome was experiencing what historians now call the crisis of imperial overextension. The empire had grown so large that supplying its frontiers was becoming economically ruinous. New resources, new trade routes, new territories that could be taxed rather than subsidized were not merely attractive to Roman leadership. They were existential necessities. An emperor who discovered a new continent would not merely be celebrated. He would be deified. His name would be carved on monuments that would last as long as stone itself. That is a powerful motivation, and powerful motivations have historically been sufficient to make people attempt impossible things. There is one more element of this picture that deserves careful attention. Among the Roman texts that survived the collapse of the empire and the subsequent burning of libraries through the medieval period, there are references to what scholars call the lost books. Texts that are cited in other surviving works, referenced by name, discussed and debated by later Roman writers, but which do not exist in any archive or collection currently accessible to researchers. Among these lost books are several that deal specifically with Western geography, with the Atlantic coast beyond Spain, with what Roman explorers reported finding when they sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, and turned their prows toward the setting sun. These books existed. Other Romans read them. Other Romans wrote about them. And then, at some point in the long and violent transition from the ancient world to the medieval one, they disappeared. Not every book burned by accident. Some books were removed because their contents were considered dangerous, because the knowledge they contained was too valuable to be public, or too destabilizing to be widely known, or simply too inconsistent with the story that powerful institutions wanted the world to believe. The Romans reached the Canary Islands, 900 miles into the Atlantic. They had ships capable of traveling further. They had the knowledge of currents and winds that would have made a western crossing not merely possible, but potentially reliable. They had the motivation. They had, if the lost texts are any indication, the documentation. And they had, as we will now begin to discover, something else entirely. They had, it appears, already been to a place that the Spanish would not officially discover for another 14 centuries. And the evidence of that visit was carved into the walls of a canyon so deep and so remote that almost no one would ever think to look there. Until one man did. In 1909, and the world was almost told about it. On the 5th of April, 1909, a newspaper called the Arizona Gazette published a story on its front page that should have rewritten the history books. Not eventually. Not after years of follow-up investigation and academic debate. Immediately. Because what the article described, if even partially true, was the most significant archaeological discovery in the history of the North American continent. The headline read, in the confident, expansive typography of early 20th century journalism, "Explorations in Grand Canyon, mysteries of immense high cavern being brought to light." And what followed was a detailed, specific, and extraordinarily strange account of what a man named G.E. Kinkaid had found in the canyon walls of the Colorado River. Kinkaid, according to the article, was an experienced explorer and government scout, a man described as having spent years navigating the rivers of the American West. He had not been looking for what he found. He had been traveling alone by boat along the Colorado River when he noticed something that should not have been there. High on the canyon wall, several hundred feet above the waterline, there was an opening in the rock. Not a natural cave mouth, irregular and wind-carved like the thousands of erosion pockets that dot the canyon walls. This was different. It was symmetrical. It was positioned at a height that made accidental discovery almost impossible. And when Kinkaid climbed up to it and went inside, he entered a world that, by his account, had no business existing on the North American continent. The article described a series of passages cut into the stone with a precision that suggested sophisticated tools and deliberate architectural planning. The main tunnel, according to Kinkaid, ran roughly a mile into the canyon wall, branching at intervals into smaller corridors that connected to chambers of varying sizes. The largest of these chambers was roughly the dimensions of a modest cathedral. In it, arranged with apparent intentionality, were objects that Kinkaid catalogued with a specificity that is either the mark of a careful observer or the product of an extraordinarily detailed imagination. There were weapons. There were tablets covered in an unknown script that Kinkaid described as bearing some resemblance to Egyptian hieroglyphs. There were copper instruments whose purpose he could not determine. There were urns and jars of a ceramic style he had never seen in any American context. And most dramatically, there was a figure. A large statue, seated, positioned in a chamber that appeared designed as a place of ceremony or worship, oriented to the east. A figure that Kinkaid described as bearing the unmistakable posture and stylistic qualities of a Buddha. But here is the detail that historians who take this account seriously find most significant. Among the objects Kinkaid described seeing in those chambers were items that, based on his descriptions, are consistent with Roman-era material culture. The copper instruments, the specific style of the urns, The architectural principle of the tunnels themselves, which he described as featuring a vaulted ceiling technique that would not have been indigenous to any North American culture of any known period, not the Anasazi, not the Hohokam, not the early Pueblo cultures. The vaulted arch was a Roman engineering signature. It was to Roman architecture what the ziggurat was to Babylon, a calling card left in stone. The article also named a second figure, Professor S. A. Jordan of the Smithsonian Institution, described as being connected to an ongoing investigation of the site, was mentioned as having led a team of researchers to the location following Kinkaid's initial report. This is important because it means that if the article was fabricated, it was fabricated with a specific institutional name attached to it, a name that could be verified or denied immediately by the institution itself. And the Smithsonian's response to queries about this discovery, when researchers have asked about it in the decades since, has been consistent and revealing. The institution states that it has no record of any Professor S. A. Jordan on its staff. It has no record of any expedition to the Grand Canyon in 1909, matching the description in the article. It has no record of any artifacts from such a site in its collections. No record of any of it. Now, there are two ways to read that response. The first way is to conclude that the Arizona Gazette article was a fabrication, a slow newsday invention by a journalist with a good imagination and a willingness to invent names and credentials. This is the explanation that mainstream archaeology has largely settled on, though it has not particularly investigated it. The second way is to notice something about the Smithsonian's denial that is, if you look at it carefully, slightly unusual. Institutions that have no knowledge of something typically say they have no knowledge of it. The Smithsonian's responses to inquiries about the Kinkaid discovery have consistently been phrased in the language of record absence, rather than the language of factual denial. We have no record of this is a very different statement than this did not happen. Records can be lost, records can be misfiled, records can be deliberately removed. The Arizona Gazette was a real newspaper. It existed, it published, it had a readership and a journalistic reputation to protect. The article was not buried in its pages. It ran on the front page, which means an editor approved it, a typesetter set it, and a press run distributed it to thousands of readers. If it had been immediately obvious as a fabrication, the newspaper would have faced the kind of public embarrassment that ended careers in the competitive journalism environment of 1909. There is no record of any such embarrassment. No retraction was published, no correction appeared. The story simply ran, and then the world moved on, and the discovery it described was gradually absorbed into the category of things that serious people do not take seriously. But some people kept looking, and what they found when they looked was not the absence of evidence that the Smithsonian's clean denial implied. What they found was the evidence of absence, the particular, specific, traceable process by which certain records disappear from institutional archives. Grand Canyon expedition logs from the early 20th century that are accessible to researchers contain a gap in the 1909 period that archivists have never been able to satisfactorily explain. Correspondence files from the Smithsonian's Anthropology Division from the same period are, for reasons not documented in any surviving administrative record, significantly thinner than the files from the years immediately before and after. And then there is the question of the location itself. Kinkaid's article gave directional coordinates relative to landmarks along the Colorado River that were specific enough to be mapped. Researchers who have attempted to locate the site using those coordinates have found themselves navigating to a section of the Grand Canyon that has been, since the establishment of Grand Canyon National Park in 1919, designated as restricted, not merely off the main tourist paths, not simply in a remote section requiring permits to access. The specific area corresponding to Kinkaid's directions is formally restricted to all public entry, administered by the federal government, and has been continuously restricted for over a century. A restricted zone, in the exact location where, in 1909, a man said he found something that should not exist. The evidence trail here does not prove what Kinkaid found. What it does, with uncomfortable insistence, is prevent anyone from going to look. And in the archaeology of forbidden knowledge, the prevention of investigation is itself a form of evidence. When institutions build walls around a question instead of answering it, the question does not go away. It simply grows larger and darker and more patient. It waits, the way the canyon itself waits, for someone to descend deep enough to find what was left at the bottom. Because Kinkaid's discovery, whatever it truly was, is not the beginning of this story. It is a door that opens onto a much older room, and the objects he described in those chambers, the vaulted ceilings, the copper instruments, the eastward-facing statue, the tablets of unknown script, these are not isolated curiosities. They are consistent with a body of evidence that extends far beyond a single newspaper article, far beyond a single man's account, and far beyond the borders of the American Southwest. To understand what may have been placed in those canyon chambers, we need to understand who was capable of placing it there. And that means returning to the ancient world and to the specific moment in Roman history when looking west became not merely a philosophical exercise, but an imperial mandate. There is a rule in archaeology that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. It is called the principle of provenance, and it states that an artifact is only as meaningful as the documented story of where it came from. Find a coin in a field, and you have an interesting object. Know exactly which layer of soil it was buried in, at what depth, in relation to what other objects, and you have a piece of evidence. The distinction matters enormously when you are trying to argue that something belongs in a place where conventional history says it cannot possibly be. The artifacts that form the physical evidence for pre-Columbian Roman contact with the Americas have a complicated relationship with provenance. Some were found before modern archaeological documentation standards existed. Some were found by non-archaeologists who moved them before they could be professionally recorded. Some were found by archaeologists whose subsequent careers suffered significantly for publishing their findings. And some, the most tantalizing ones, were found, documented, reported to institutional authorities, and then the documentation vanished, while the artifacts themselves were placed in storage facilities not accessible to independent researchers. This is the landscape of the evidence. Imperfect, contested, but persistent. Begin with the coins. Roman coins have been found in North America in numbers that defy comfortable explanation. Not in the quantities that would suggest a major trading relationship, but in the scattered, geographically distributed pattern that suggests multiple points of contact over an extended period of time. Roman coins have been recovered in states as geographically diverse as Texas, Alabama, Illinois, and Missouri. They have been found in Virginia, in the Ohio River Valley, and in contexts that, where the original excavation records survive, are inconsistent with the explanation of modern importation or deliberate planting by collectors. The coins span multiple imperial periods, from the Republic through the late Empire. They are not clustered in a single time period, which would suggest a single contact event. They are distributed across centuries, which suggests something more sustained. In 1963, a cache of what appeared to be Roman coins was found in a field in Texas. The finder reported it. The coins were examined by a professional numismatist, who confirmed their apparent authenticity. They were then taken for further analysis, and the subsequent report, which should have been a matter of public record, was never published. The original finder, a farmer named Virgil Turner, gave an interview to a local newspaper shortly after the coins were taken, and was never publicly heard from again on the subject. The coins are not in any publicly accessible collection. Then there are the figurines. In the 1930s, in the Mexican state of Guerrero, a construction project at the ancient site of Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca uncovered a small ceramic head buried beneath an offering mound. The head was pre-Columbian in context, meaning it was buried before any known European contact. But the head itself was unmistakably Mediterranean in style. The hairstyle, the beard, the facial features, the technique used to render the ceramic were all consistent with Roman portrait sculpture of the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. This was not a casual similarity. It was specific enough that when the object was photographed and examined by multiple classical art historians without being told where it came from, they consistently identified it as consistent with Roman or Hellenistic ceramic production. The figurine, known now as the Tecaxic head, sits in a museum in Mexico City. It has not been actively disputed as a forgery, though forgery is the automatic institutional response when such artifacts are raised in academic contexts. What has happened instead is the more characteristic response to evidence of this kind: silence. A few papers were written, generated mild controversy in specialized journals, and the object settled back into the comfortable obscurity of a museum display case, with a description that carefully avoids mentioning how anomalous it is. Move now to a discovery that is both more recent and more directly relevant to the Grand Canyon question. In the 1990s, a series of petroglyphs, images carved into stone, were identified in multiple locations across the American Southwest, including the regions adjacent to the Grand Canyon, that bear striking similarity to Roman and Phoenician symbols. The similarity was not claimed by amateur enthusiasts with an agenda. It was noted formally by Dr. Barry Fell, a Harvard professor and marine biologist who became one of the most controversial figures in the field of ancient epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions. Fell spent decades documenting what he argued was overwhelming evidence of pre-Columbian Old World contact with the Americas, and was for his trouble subjected to a level of professional dismissal that his defenders argue was disproportionate to the actual weakness of his evidence. Fell's work had flaws. His methodology was sometimes looser than professional standards demanded. But his central observation, that certain petroglyphs in the American Southwest contain symbol clusters that are statistically improbable to have occurred independently of contact with Old World writing systems, has not been convincingly refuted. It has been dismissed. Those are not the same thing. There is also the matter of Roman-era plants. This sounds obscure, but it is one of the strongest categories of contact evidence, because plants do not travel by accident across 3,000 miles of open ocean. Botanical analysis of pre-Columbian plant remains in the Americas has identified the presence of species that are native to the Mediterranean and Middle East. Specifically, there is evidence of tobacco in Egyptian mummies, which has been extensively documented, and evidence of coca leaves in contexts that predate any known contact period. The biological exchange of plants requires either extraordinary meteorological coincidence or human agency. Researchers who argue for the latter are not fringe theorists. They include tenured botanists and archaeologists at major research universities, all of whom publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals to responses that range from polite skepticism to professional retaliation. And then there are the most difficult artifacts of all, the ones that should not be anywhere near where they were found. In the mid-20th century, during excavations related to dam construction projects along the Colorado River system, several objects were recovered that were turned over to the Smithsonian Institution for classification. Among these objects were copper items that did not match any known indigenous metallurgical tradition of the region. Copper items that, in their construction technique and their alloy composition, were consistent with Roman-era metalworking from the 1st through 3rd centuries. The objects were logged in. They were assigned catalogue numbers. And then, over the course of subsequent decades, those catalogue entries were marked as reassigned, which in institutional archival terminology means the objects were moved to a different storage location. A location that, when researchers have attempted to access it, does not appear in any public finding aid. The pattern is not random. That is the thing that stands out when you lay all of this evidence together and step back far enough to see its shape. Random loss of artifacts produces a random pattern of absences. What the evidence of pre-Columbian Roman contact in the Americas produces is a directed pattern. The most significant objects disappear. The most specific documentation becomes unavailable. The researchers who pursue the question most vigorously find their professional careers encountering unexpected friction. And the institutions that should be most interested in resolving the question instead demonstrate a consistent, sustained, almost tireless commitment to not resolving it. Something was found. In the canyon walls, in the Brazilian harbor floor, in the fields of Texas, and the offering mounds of Mexico. Something that did not fit the story the official institutions had decided to tell. And rather than change the story, the decision was made, quietly, incrementally, deniably, to make the something disappear, to delete the archive rather than revise the narrative. But archives are patient, and stone, in particular, has a very long memory. The canyon walls that may have absorbed the footsteps of Roman explorers 2,000 years ago are still standing. The petroglyphs carved into them have not erased themselves. And the question of who put them there, who created those chambers and left those objects in that particular remote and protected section of the American Southwest, demands an answer. To find that answer, we need to go deeper, not just into the canyon, but into the history of the people who may have descended it first. We need to understand what a Roman expedition to the American continent would have actually looked like, who would have been on it, how it would have been organized, and why the canyon, of all the vast and varied landscape of the Americas, may have been exactly the kind of place a Roman explorer would have considered worth the climb. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a Roman logistician in the 1st century of the Common Era. You have been given an assignment by someone with the authority to give such assignments. You are to plan an expedition beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the known trading routes of the Western Atlantic, into territory that may or may not exist, based on reports that are themselves based on reports passed through at least 2 layers of translation and interpretation. You must determine what ships to use, what provisions to carry, how many men to bring, what specialists are necessary, and what the expedition is officially supposed to be doing while it is actually doing something else. Because official Roman expeditions of this nature were almost never described accurately in public records. The true purpose of strategic exploration was always documented separately from the administrative record that would be visible to rivals, to enemies, and to the general population of the empire. This is the organizational framework within which a Roman expedition to the Americas would have been conceived and executed. And understanding that framework is essential to understanding both how such an expedition could have occurred and why its records might have been so comprehensively removed from history. The Roman military and exploratory apparatus had a specific unit type for missions of this nature. The exploratores were reconnaissance specialists, trained not for frontal combat, but for information gathering, for navigation, for the documentation of new territories and peoples. They operated in small, fast-moving units, led by officers who combined military training with geographical and diplomatic knowledge. An expedition of the type we are describing would have been built around a core of exploratores, supported by naval specialists, supplied by merchant vessels that provided cover as a trading expedition, and commanded by an officer whose identity and mission were known only to the emperor and to a very small number of senior administrators. The ships available to such an expedition in the 1st century were more capable than most people imagine. Roman merchant vessels, the corbitor type, regularly displaced between 100 and 250 tons. They carried provisions for extended voyages. They used a combination of sail configurations that allowed them to navigate across wind, not merely with it. And critically, Roman navigators had astronomical knowledge that enabled open ocean navigation. They knew how to fix latitude using star positions. They understood, from observation of the moon and from records kept over centuries, how to anticipate weather patterns. They were not as sophisticated as later European navigators, who had the magnetic compass, but they were not helpless either. They were, in fact, about as capable of open ocean navigation as Norse sailors who, in the 10th century, made the crossing to North America without significant difficulty and without any technology that 1st century Romans lacked. The provisioning of such an expedition would have been standardized. Roman military and expeditionary logistics were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. A voyage of 3 to 4 weeks, which is roughly the time it would take to cross from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean following the trade winds, would have required approximately 90 days of provisions per man to allow for the voyage out, time on the ground, and a return journey. Preserved foods, specifically the Roman staples of hardtack, dried fish, olive oil in sealed amphoras, and posca, a vinegar and water mixture used as a safe drinking liquid on long voyages, would have formed the core of the provision list. The Romans were, among other things, supremely practical in their understanding of what the human body needed to remain functional over extended periods. Now consider who would have been included in the expedition beyond the military and naval corps. Any Roman expedition of strategic significance would have carried a scribe, someone whose job was to document everything, to record every observation, to produce the written report that the emperor was expecting upon return. This scribe would have kept a daily log, would have catalogued every artifact and every observation made in the new territory, would have produced the maps and the inventories that were the real product of the expedition. And it would have been this documentation, this log, and these maps and these catalogues that would later become the material of the lost books. The texts that were referenced in other Roman writings, but that do not survive in any accessible archive. The expedition would also have carried interpreters, or at least people skilled in the rapid acquisition of new languages. Roman diplomatic and military culture placed enormous value on linguistic intelligence. The ability to communicate with peoples encountered during expansion was not merely a convenience, it was a strategic necessity. Any group of Romans reaching the American continent would have encountered indigenous peoples within days of their arrival. The nature of those encounters, whether hostile, peaceful, or somewhere between, would have depended significantly on the expedition's ability to establish at least a rudimentary communicative framework. And here is something that deserves particular attention. Some researchers who take the Roman contact hypothesis seriously have pointed to indigenous oral traditions from cultures in the American Southwest, specifically from the Hopi and Zuni peoples, whose ancestral territories include regions adjacent to the Grand Canyon, that describe encounters with ancient visitors who came from the east, across the water, who carried metal implements, who wore distinctive clothing, and who stayed for a period before departing. These traditions are not commonly included in mainstream discussions of pre-Columbian contact. But they exist. They have been documented by anthropologists, and they describe a set of visitors who do not match any known pre-Columbian culture from any adjacent region of the Americas. Now, think about the canyon itself. If a Roman expedition had arrived in the American Southwest, coming inland from the Gulf of California via the Colorado River, as the geography strongly suggests would have been the most logical inland route, the Grand Canyon would not have been a destination they chose. It would have been a destination the river chose for them. The Colorado River flows through the Grand Canyon. Any waterborne expedition ascending the river from the south would have entered the canyon automatically. And the canyon, with its vertical walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, its chambers and alcoves carved by millennia of water and wind, its almost supernatural isolation from the world above, would have been exactly the kind of place that a Roman expedition tasked with documentation would have found significant. Sacred, perhaps. Strategically important, certainly. A place where things could be stored, cached, hidden, in chambers that the river's own geometry had already carved into the walls. And a Roman scribe, confronted with the experience of the Grand Canyon, which even in our over-documented modern world renders most visitors temporarily speechless, would have written about it, would have attempted to capture in Latin the experience of descending into a mile-deep corridor of stone that makes every human construction look trivially small. That report would have been extraordinary. It would have been one of the most vivid pieces of travel writing in the ancient world. And if it existed, and was later removed from accessible archives, its absence would be one of the most significant literary losses in human history. Whether the expedition returned, whether it produced its report, whether that report was received, read, and then buried under layers of institutional decision-making. These are the questions that occupy the space between what we can prove and what we can only, so far, demonstrate as possible. But the possible, in this case, is supported by enough parallel evidence that dismissing it requires more intellectual effort than most institutions are willing to make public. They prefer silence. And in that silence, the question keeps living. The canyon keeps its secrets in its stone. And somewhere, in an archive that is either lost or deliberately unavailable, a Roman scribe's careful Latin handwriting may be describing the most beautiful and the most terrifying geographical feature he had ever seen. We have looked at the Roman side of this equation. We have examined the evidence left behind in the American soil and the American stone. Now it is time to look at the most uncomfortable part of this entire story, the part that moves this narrative from the realm of ancient history into the realm of modern institutional behavior. Because the Roman expedition, if it happened 2,000 years ago. The people who made the decision to erase its evidence from accessible history did not live 2,000 years ago. They lived in the 20th century. Some of them may still be alive, and the institution at the center of that erasure, the Smithsonian Institution, is not an ancient empire. It is a modern American organization with a contemporary budget, a contemporary board of directors, and a contemporary responsibility to the public it claims to serve. The Smithsonian Institution is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most important cultural and scientific organizations in the history of the United States. Founded in 1846 with a bequest from British scientist James Smithson, a man who had never set foot in America and whose motivations for leaving his fortune to a country he had never visited remain one of history's minor mysteries, the institution has grown into the world's largest museum and research complex. It holds approximately 155 million objects across its collections. It employs thousands of researchers, curators, conservators, and administrators. Its annual operating budget runs into billions of dollars, a significant portion of which comes directly from federal appropriations. It is, in the most literal sense, a public institution. It belongs to the American people, which makes what follows a matter of public interest rather than fringe speculation. The accusation, leveled not by conspiracy theorists, but by professional archaeologists, historians, and investigative researchers, is specific and serious. It is not that the Smithsonian has been incompetent or careless in its management of pre-Columbian contact evidence. It is that the institution has demonstrated, across multiple decades and multiple instances, a systematic pattern of suppressing, losing, or reclassifying artifacts and documentation that are inconsistent with the official narrative of American prehistory. The narrative that says no civilization from the Old World had meaningful contact with the Americas before Columbus. The narrative that the Smithsonian has been, from its earliest years of operation, a primary institutional guardian of. The pattern begins to become visible in the late 19th century. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, established in 1879, took on the role of the official arbiter of American archaeological findings. What this meant in practice was that any significant find made anywhere in the United States was expected to be reported to the Bureau, which would then send investigators, classify the find, and determine what it meant and how it would be described to the public. This is not unusual for a major research institution. What is unusual is the consistency with which findings that challenge the pre-Columbian isolation model, the idea that the Americas were entirely disconnected from the Old World before 1492, were classified in ways that made them inaccessible, moved to storage facilities not catalogued in public finding aids, or simply recorded as lost. The book that brought this pattern to the widest public attention was published in 1992. David Hatcher, Childress, and a number of co-investigators published a compilation of evidence for what they called the suppression of pre-Columbian contact archaeology, specifically targeting the Smithsonian's handling of anomalous finds. The book was dismissed by mainstream academia, which is not surprising. What is more interesting is the specific nature of the dismissal. Rather than engaging with the documented evidence of missing catalogue entries and reclassified objects, the institutional response focused on questioning the credibility of the researchers. This is a rhetorical move that has a name in logic: ad hominem. It attacks the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. When an institution consistently chooses ad hominem over evidence engagement, that choice itself becomes a form of evidence. More formally, in the decades since, several Freedom of Information Act requests have been submitted to various federal agencies, including those with administrative relationships to the Smithsonian, seeking access to records related to the 1909 Grand Canyon expedition described in the Arizona Gazette. The responses to these requests have been consistently incomplete. Some records are described as not existing. Others are described as existing but falling under exemptions related to ongoing research programs. Others produce heavily redacted documents whose remaining text is insufficient to determine what the original document contained. The not existing response is particularly interesting because the Smithsonian, unlike most federal agencies, does not operate under a strict public records mandate. Its archives are governed by its own internal access policies, which it sets and modifies independently. This means that when the Smithsonian says it has no record of something, it is not making a statement that can be verified against an independent standard. It is making a statement about its own internal filing system that no external authority has the power to audit. There is a name for this kind of structural situation. It is called an accountability gap. And the Smithsonian's accountability gap around pre-Columbian contact research is not a secret. It has been discussed in academic papers, in investigative journalism, and in the formal submissions of researchers who have spent careers trying to access objects and documentation. They have traced through partial records to institutional storage. The gap is documented. What is documented less often is why it exists. Here is one theory that deserves serious consideration, not because it is comforting, but because it is coherent. The Smithsonian was established at a specific moment in American intellectual history, when the dominant framework for understanding North American prehistory was one that served a particular political purpose. The idea that the Americas were populated exclusively by indigenous peoples who had no meaningful contact with the Old World until Columbus served to simplify a complicated story. It created a clean before and after narrative. Before Columbus, isolation. After Columbus, contact. This narrative made it easier to describe the relationship between European civilization and indigenous American civilization in terms that minimized the complexity and, in some cases, the anteriority of indigenous cultural achievement. If pre-Columbian contact from Rome or any other Old World civilization had been widely acknowledged, the story became dramatically more complicated. It raised questions about who was here first, in a sense that went beyond the simple arrival of humans in the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge. It raised questions about the nature of exchange and influence between hemispheres over a much longer time period. It raised questions about indigenous cultures that had incorporated outside contact into their development in ways that mainstream archaeology was not prepared to account for. It was, in short, a story that complicated the institutional picture at exactly the moment when American institutions were trying very hard to make the picture simple. None of this proves that the Smithsonian deliberately destroyed evidence of Roman contact with the Grand Canyon. What it establishes is something more subtle and in some ways more troubling. It establishes that the institution had structural incentives to manage anomalous evidence in ways that preserved the dominant narrative. That its internal access policies made such management possible without creating the kind of paper trail that would constitute proof of deliberate suppression. And that the pattern of anomalous artifact disappearance, when mapped across more than a century of institutional history, is consistent with managed suppression rather than innocent organizational failure. The canyon, meanwhile, has not said anything. It simply continues to exist, layered and silent, its restricted zones patrolled, and its deeper chambers, if they exist, undisturbed by the researchers who might resolve the question once and for all. The institution that controls access to those zones maintains its silence. The archive remains deleted. But the evidence that has survived the deletion points in a direction, and that direction leads not only into the physical depths of the canyon, but into a question that has been waiting in the margins of history for much longer than a century. The question of whether the Romans were the only Old World civilization to have reached these shores, because the artifacts and the symbols and the architectural signatures in the canyon point to something that is simultaneously more specific and more complex than a single Roman expedition. They point to a tradition of Western exploration that may have begun even before Rome, with the people from whom Rome learned almost everything it knew about sailing, about navigation, about the courage to look beyond the horizon and keep going, the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians, it turns out, have their own relationship with the American Southwest, one that is older, stranger, and in some ways even more difficult to explain away than anything Rome left behind. Before Rome learned to build ships that could survive open ocean, before Rome learned to navigate by stars, before Rome understood the economics of long-distance trade and the diplomacy of encountering unknown peoples, there was a civilization that had been doing all of those things for centuries. A civilization that left so little physical trace on the historical record that most people, if you asked them to name the greatest seafaring culture of the ancient world, would name the Greeks or the Vikings before they thought to mention the people who were actually, by most historical measures, the most extraordinary maritime explorers of antiquity, the Phoenicians, the Purple People, as their name approximately translates, the traders, the navigators, the alphabet inventors, the shadow civilization that built the infrastructure of the ancient Mediterranean, and then, with the characteristic modesty of a culture that considered its commercial routes more valuable than its monuments, left almost no record of how far that infrastructure actually extended. The Phoenicians originated on the narrow coastal strip of what is now Lebanon and parts of Syria and Israel. They were hemmed in on one side by mountains and on the other by the sea. And so, with the particular creativity that geography forces on people, they became the sea. They built ships of Lebanese cedar, which was among the finest shipbuilding timber in the ancient world. They developed hull designs that were seaworthy in ways that no Mediterranean contemporary could match. They created a network of coastal trading posts that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of Africa and Spain. By the 7th century before the Common Era, they had sailed around the entire continent of Africa, a feat that would not be duplicated by European navigators until 15 centuries later. We know they did this because the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II commissioned the circumnavigation, and Herodotus, the Greek historian, recorded it with a detail that is itself revealing. Herodotus wrote that he did not believe the Phoenicians' report that the sun was on their right as they sailed around Africa's southern tip, because that would be impossible. What Herodotus did not know, and what we do know, is that this is exactly what would happen when sailing westward south of the equator. The Phoenician sailors were describing a real experience. Herodotus's disbelief is our confirmation. A civilization that could circumnavigate Africa in the 7th century before the Common Era was not technologically incapable of crossing the Atlantic in the centuries that followed. The Phoenicians already had outposts on the Canary Islands. They already knew the Atlantic currents. They already had the hull designs and the navigational knowledge and the commercial motivation. What they had in addition to all of that was a cultural characteristic that made them uniquely suited to reaching the Americas and leaving almost no verifiable trace. They did not want anyone to know where they had been. This was not paranoia. It was business strategy. The Phoenician trading empire was built on the control of information. The routes they sailed, the sources they used for tin and silver and purple dye, the peoples they traded with in distant regions. All of this information was the intellectual property that gave Phoenicia its commercial advantage. Phoenician captains were known, documented in classical sources, to have deliberately sailed into the path of foreign ships when they were approaching important trading destinations, luring the foreign vessels onto rocks and shoals rather than allow them to follow and discover the route. When a Phoenician ship's captain found a new source of valuable goods, he did not publish a map. He went home, reported to his merchant backers, and then went back to exploit the resource while keeping its location secret. This helps explain something that has puzzled researchers who take the pre-Columbian contact hypothesis seriously. The absence of large-scale, permanent Phoenician settlements in the Americas is not evidence that the Phoenicians were not there. It is consistent with their standard practice. The Phoenicians did not colonize in the Roman sense. They built trading posts, small, functional, impermanent structures designed to facilitate exchange rather than establish dominance. They came, they traded, they left, and they took their route information with them, locked in the memories of ship captains whose knowledge was too valuable to write down. But things were written down, not by the Phoenicians themselves, but by others who encountered them or who had access to accounts of their voyages. Among the classical sources that survive in fragmentary form, there are references to Phoenician voyages into the Great Western Ocean that are specific enough to suggest genuine geographical knowledge rather than mythological invention. The pseudo-Aristotle text, known as De Mirabilibus Auscultationibus, a collection of marvels and curiosities compiled from earlier sources, describes a large island in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules, rich in forests and rivers and abundant in resources. That the Carthaginians, who were the Western Phoenicians centered in North Africa, had discovered and subsequently forbidden anyone else from visiting under penalty of death. The Carthaginian Senate, according to this account, was so concerned about potential colonization that would deplete this resource base that they enacted specific laws against settlement. An island in the Atlantic, forbidden by law from settlement, abundant in natural resources. This description is consistent with a number of things, including the Caribbean island chain, the eastern coast of the Americas more broadly, and the specific resource profile of a continent that later European explorers would describe in almost identical terms: forests, rivers, and almost incomprehensible natural abundance. Now layer onto this the epigraphic evidence. Barry Fell, the Harvard professor mentioned in an earlier chapter, spent a significant portion of his career documenting what he argued was Phoenician script in locations across the Americas. His most controversial claim, and the one that generated the most intense professional hostility, was that certain petroglyphs in the American Southwest, specifically in New Mexico and in the regions adjacent to the Colorado River drainage, contained Phoenician and Punic writing, Punic being the later development of Phoenician used by the Carthaginians. Not decorative marks that resembled Phoenician script. Actual inscriptions that, when translated according to established Phoenician grammatical and lexical rules, produced coherent sentences. Fell's translations were disputed. Some linguists argued that his methodology was insufficiently rigorous, but the dispute was not simple. Several of the translations he proposed were subsequently re-examined by independent epigraphers who reached similar conclusions. And the petroglyphs themselves, the physical objects in the stone, remain in place and remain unexplained by any alternative hypothesis that mainstream archaeology has proposed. They are not the work of any known indigenous culture. They are not explained by natural erosion processes. They are inscribed marks that someone made deliberately in a location in the American Southwest that, if you trace the most logical waterborne route from the Gulf of California, you would reach by ascending the Colorado River. The same canyon, the same walls. And here is where the Phoenician thread and the Roman thread converge in a way that makes the overall picture suddenly more coherent rather than more complicated. Rome absorbed Phoenician knowledge. When Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 before the Common Era, it did not simply defeat a military rival. It inherited an intellectual archive. Captured Carthaginian texts were brought to Rome. Carthaginian geographic knowledge was absorbed into the Roman geographical tradition. The things the Phoenicians and Carthaginians knew about the Western Atlantic, the routes, the currents, the land masses, would not have died with Carthage. They would have been transferred to Rome, added to the Roman geographical corpus, and eventually used by Roman planners and navigators who had no obligation to credit the civilization they had destroyed for the knowledge they were now using. So, when we ask whether a Roman expedition to the Grand Canyon is plausible, we are not merely asking whether Romans were capable of the navigation. We are asking whether Romans, inheritors of Phoenician geographical knowledge, using Phoenician-developed routes and Phoenician-documented currents, with Roman organizational capability and Roman imperial motivation, could have followed a path that had perhaps already been partially traced by the civilization Rome had absorbed. The answer becomes less a question of possibility and more a question of timing and documentation. Not whether anyone from the Old World reached the canyon, but when and how many times, and who, in successive centuries, made the decision that this knowledge should not become part of the shared historical record. What those visitors, Phoenician or Roman or both in succession, found in the canyon, what they made of it, what they left behind and what they took away, these questions lead us now to the most intimate part of this story. Not the civilizations but the individuals, not the empires but the people inside them. The scouts, the scribes, the sailors who stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon 2,000 years before the tourists arrived and looked down into that impossible depth and tried to find words for what they were seeing. Because what they saw, we have reason to believe, they also recorded, and what they recorded may still exist, somewhere in the labyrinth of institutional archives that the modern world has built around its own inconvenient history. Long before it became a national park, long before it became a geological wonder studied by scientists and photographed by tourists, long before the Spanish soldiers stood at its rim and turned their horses around in silent awe, the Grand Canyon was a place of profound spiritual significance to the peoples who lived within its reach. The Havasupai, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Zuni, the Paiute, these nations, and several others, have maintained continuous relationships with the canyon for millennia. Their stories about it, their ceremonies connected to it, their oral traditions that encode its history in forms designed to survive the absence of written records, constitute one of the most ancient and least consulted archives in the American world. The academic treatment of indigenous oral tradition has been, to put it generously, inconsistent. When oral tradition supports the dominant archaeological narrative, it is treated as a charming cultural supplement, a human interest layer added to the hard data of excavation and carbon dating. When it contradicts the dominant narrative, it is characterized as myth, as spiritual metaphor, as the kind of truth that operates in a different register from historical fact. This distinction is not neutral. It is a methodological choice that conveniently produces a particular result. Indigenous oral tradition is admissible as evidence only when it agrees with what institutions have already decided to believe. Which makes it all the more interesting that the oral traditions of multiple cultures connected to the Grand Canyon contain specific references to ancient visitors that do not fit any known pre-Columbian cultural category. The Hopi people, whose ancestral territories have included regions of the Colorado Plateau adjacent to the canyon for centuries beyond counting, preserve traditions that describe a time when their ancestors shared the canyon with beings called the Pahana, the lost white brother who would one day return. The Pahana tradition is complex and theologically rich, and oversimplifying it would be a disservice to the culture that preserves it. But within it are specific details that are worth noting in this context. The Pahana are described as having come from a great distance. They are described as having possessed knowledge and objects unlike anything in the Hopi cultural inventory. And they are described as having departed with the promise of return, a promise that has been, in the Hopi calendar of expectation, associated with specific signs that would accompany the Pahana's second arrival. Researchers who have examined the Pahana tradition in the context of pre-Columbian contact have noted that several of the described characteristics of these ancient visitors are consistent with what a Roman expedition would have presented to the indigenous peoples of the region: metal objects, unfamiliar clothing, a traveling group composed entirely of men, navigation by celestial observation, and a communication style that attempted through gesture and partial linguistic exchange to establish peaceful rather than hostile contact. None of this proves that the Pahana of Hopi tradition were Romans. What it establishes is that Hopi oral tradition contains a memory of strangers who do not fit any other explanatory category available in the standard pre-Columbian contact framework. The Zuni people have their own body of tradition that overlaps with this territory in ways that have attracted the attention of researchers for a very different reason. The Zuni language is, by linguistic analysis, one of the most unusual in the Americas. It is a language isolate, meaning it appears to share no common ancestry with any other known language family. Linguists who have studied it extensively have proposed, and the proposal remains deeply controversial, that it shows statistical similarities to certain ancient Japanese linguistic structures. Others have identified elements within it that show possible correlation with Semitic language families. The Semitic family includes the languages of the ancient Middle East, among them Phoenician, Hebrew, and Aramaic. If Zuni linguistic structure genuinely contains elements borrowed from or related to a Semitic ancestor language, the implications are significant. Languages do not change without contact. Vocabulary does not cross language families without speakers of different languages spending meaningful time together. The Zuni oral tradition also includes accounts of ancestral kachinas, spirit figures, who came from the east and the south and brought knowledge of building and of seasonal ceremony. Among the kachina figures in Zuni ceremonial tradition, there are some whose iconographic representation, when examined by classical art historians, who have done so without being told. The cultural context bears structural similarity to Roman votive figures. Not identical, structurally similar. The posture, the gesture vocabulary, the object-holding conventions. These similarities, like so many pieces of this puzzle, fall in the space between coincidence and confirmation. But they cluster in the same direction that all the other evidence points, and that clustering is itself meaningful. Now consider the geography of the canyon in the context of sacred space. The Grand Canyon was not merely spectacular to the indigenous peoples of the region, it was theologically central. The Hopi believe that the canyon is where their ancestors emerged into the current world from a lower realm of existence. The Navajo consider it a boundary between ordered human space and the powerful, dangerous space of the holy people. Multiple traditions converge on the canyon as a place where the natural world and the spirit world are unusually close together. where the membrane between them is thin, where encounters with non-human powers are not exceptional but expected. This is the kind of place that a Roman expedition, with its own rich tradition of sacred geography, would have found immediately significant. Romans understood sacred spaces. They understood the concept of a locus, a place that was marked by divine presence, that required careful approach and appropriate ceremony. A canyon of incomprehensible scale, descending into darkness, associated by its indigenous inhabitants with the boundary between worlds, would have registered to Roman religious sensibility as exactly the kind of place that deserved acknowledgement. That deserved offerings. That deserved the kinds of objects and the kinds of inscriptions that say we were here, and we understood that this place was something beyond ordinary geography. This provides a potential explanation for the nature of what Kinkaid described finding in the 1909 chambers. Not a random cache of stored equipment, not a simple survival shelter, but a deliberate installation of significant objects in a space that was recognized as sacred, a Roman votive deposit, essentially. The ancient Roman practice of leaving valuable objects in sacred locations as offerings to the divine presence of the place, adapted to an American context. Created by people who were sophisticated enough to recognize the sacred character of what they were seeing, even without the cultural framework to fully understand it. The canyon remembers all of this. Its layers of stone encode histories so old they predate human presence on the continent. And in those walls, in the chambers that Kinkaid described and that the federal government has kept restricted for over a century, in the petroglyphs that fell documented, and that mainstream archaeology has declined to explain, in the oral traditions of the people who have lived in relationship with this place since before any known history began, there is an archive, one that has not been deleted, one that cannot be deleted because its medium is not paper or digital files, but stone and memory, and the careful oral transmission of stories across generations, too numerous to count. The last pieces of this archive are the hardest to reach, not because they are physically inaccessible, though some are, but because they require confronting the most uncomfortable question in this entire investigation. Not whether Romans reached the Grand Canyon, not whether the Smithsonian suppressed the evidence, but why any of it matters. What difference it makes to the living world if an ancient empire's explorers stood where American tourists now stand, looked at the same impossible depth, and felt the same helpless awe. What hangs on the answer? And who, if the answer were fully known, would be most profoundly changed by it? History is not only what happened in the past. History is also what we decide to remember about the past, and more revealingly, what we decide to forget. The people who make those decisions are not shadowy figures in underground rooms. They are academics with university affiliations. They are institutional administrators with budget lines and publication approvals. They are journal editors who decide what gets peer review and what gets quietly declined. They are grant committees that fund certain lines of research and defund others. They are, in most cases, entirely ordinary people, doing what ordinary people do when their professional survival depends on maintaining institutional consensus. They go along, they look away. They decide that the career cost of pursuing an inconvenient question is higher than the intellectual reward of answering it. But not everyone. And the people who did not go along, who kept pulling on the thread even after it became professionally costly, whose careers absorbed the friction of asking questions that institutions had decided were closed, are the ones who have kept this investigation alive. Their work is imperfect. Their methodology is sometimes uneven. But their persistence has produced a body of evidence that cannot be simply dismissed, even by the institutions that have tried. Start with Dr. Gunnar Thompson, a researcher who spent decades documenting what he called the pre-Columbian discovery of America, focusing specifically on the evidence for Roman and Mediterranean contact with the Western Hemisphere. Thompson approached the evidence with a training that combined art history, cartography, and classical studies, which gave him an analytical framework that purely archaeological approaches to the question often lack. His examination of pre-Columbian artifacts from across the Americas, specifically looking at decorative and iconographic conventions that appear to derive from Mediterranean artistic traditions, produced a catalogue of parallels that he spent years attempting to publish in mainstream venues. His manuscripts were rejected by major academic publishers with explanations that, as he documented in subsequent publications, were not primarily about the quality of his evidence, but about the nature of his conclusions. Thompson eventually published independently, which in the academic world is equivalent to placing yourself outside the gates. Independent publication means peer review is not mandatory, which means institutional credibility is harder to establish, which means your work is easier to dismiss. The circle is self-reinforcing and self-serving. It does not disprove what Thompson found. It simply ensures that what Thompson found will not be taught in university courses. Then there is Carl Johannessen, an emeritus professor of geography at the University of Oregon, whose research focused on a different category of evidence: botanical. Johannessen spent years documenting the presence of American plant species in pre-Columbian Old World contexts and Old World plant species in pre-Columbian American contexts. His work on the presence of corn, which is native to the Americas, in Indian temple carvings dated to before any known contact period, attracted particular attention and particularly vigorous institutional resistance. Corn, or maize, should not have been known in India before Columbus. But there it was, carved in stone in a form specific enough that botanists, not historians, have confirmed the identification. Johannessen's papers were published in peer-reviewed journals, passed through the process that is supposed to constitute the gold standard of academic validation, and then were strategically ignored. Not refuted, not addressed with counter-evidence, ignored. In the Grand Canyon specifically, the researcher whose work has been most directly relevant to the questions raised in this investigation is a journalist-turned-researcher named David Hatcher Childress, whose methodology is more popular than academic, but whose documentation of the specific institutional paper trail around the 1909 Kinkaid discovery is more detailed than anything produced by credentialed academics. Childress tracked the Arizona Gazette article through institutional archives, attempted to obtain Smithsonian records related to the 1909 expedition through Freedom of Information mechanisms, and documented the specific pattern of record absence that surrounds the entire episode. His conclusions were presented in accessible popular books rather than academic journals, which has made them easy to dismiss as entertainment. But the documentary evidence he assembled, the specific dates, the specific catalogue numbers, the specific correspondence trails that end in unexplained gaps, is real. It is verifiable in the portions that remain accessible. And the portions that are not accessible, the portions that should be there and are not, are the ones that matter most. There is also a researcher named Dr. John L. Sorensen, an anthropologist whose career was more conventionally academic than Thompson's or Childress's, who spent decades working on what he called transoceanic contact research. Sorensen's approach was systematic in a way that is difficult to dismiss. He built a comprehensive database of parallels between Old World and New World cultures, focusing specifically on those elements that could not be explained by independent invention and could not be explained by coincidence. His methodology was transparent and his conclusions were specific. He argued, based on the cumulative weight of evidence across multiple categories, plants, artifacts, linguistic parallels, artistic conventions, and architectural similarities, that the Americas had experienced multiple contacts from multiple Old World cultures across a period of several millennia. Not one contact event, not a single Roman expedition. A sustained, multi-generational pattern of crossing and exchange that the conventional academic framework had been designed, whether intentionally or structurally, to render invisible. Sorensen's work received more mainstream engagement than most researchers in this field. He published with university presses. He presented at academic conferences. He was not dismissed as a crank because his methodology was too careful to dismiss on methodological grounds. What happened instead was something more sophisticated. His work was engaged with selectively. The pieces of his evidence that could be absorbed into the conventional framework were absorbed. The pieces that fundamentally challenged it were characterized as requiring more evidence before conclusions could be drawn. How much more evidence? The standard was never specified. It was a standard of sufficient evidence that moved away, as he approached it, like a horizon. And then there are the researchers who never published anything at all. The field archaeologists, the graduate students, the professional excavators who have found Roman-consistent artifacts in American contexts, reported them through proper channels, and been told quietly and firmly that their findings could not be characterized as they appeared in the field, that further analysis was needed, that the objects would be transferred to institutional care for proper study, and who then watched those objects disappear into the institutional care that was supposed to produce the further analysis that never came. These researchers do not have published papers to point to. They have informal testimonies, shared in conversations, and in anonymous correspondence with independent researchers that describe a pattern of institutional management of inconvenient evidence that is, taken together, deeply troubling. The investigation is not dead. It has not been closed. Every few years, a new piece of evidence emerges. A new analysis of existing artifacts using more sophisticated technology produces results that reinforce the contact hypothesis. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in restricted sections of the Grand Canyon region, conducted for ostensibly geological purposes, have produced subsurface anomalies in the location. Kinkaid's coordinates indicate that are consistent with artificial chambers. These results have been published in geological literature, characterized as geological anomalies, and not followed up with archaeological investigation. The technology exists to look. The institutional will to look does not. This is perhaps the most honest summary of where the investigation stands as of the present day. Not defeated, not vindicated, suspended, held in a state of deliberately maintained inconclusiveness by institutions that have structural reasons to prefer. The question remain open in the form of uncertainty rather than closed in the form of a confirmed answer. Because a confirmed answer would require a reckoning, not just with ancient history, but with the modern history of how that ancient history was managed, with the specific decisions made by specific people in specific decades to prevent the public from knowing what their publicly funded institutions knew and decided to suppress. That reckoning has not happened. Whether it ever will depends on factors that extend beyond archaeology, beyond history, beyond even the specific question of Romans in the Grand Canyon. It depends on whether the institutions that control the evidence decide, or are compelled, to open what they have closed, to restore what they have deleted, to let the archive speak in its own voice, rather than in the carefully managed voice of institutional consensus. The canyon has waited this long. It will wait longer if necessary. But the question, unlike the stone, does not get more patient with time. It gets louder. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of suppression. A silence that requires people to say nothing when they know something. That requires institutions to file things in places where they cannot be found. That requires the slow, careful redirection of curious researchers toward questions that are safe and away from questions that are not. This kind of silence is exhausting to maintain, and it is, by nature, temporary. Because the evidence it is trying to contain does not decay. It does not lose its charge over time. If anything, it accumulates. Every new piece of technology that can see through stone, every new analytical method that can date objects with greater precision, every new researcher who comes to the question without the career investments that make honesty costly, adds to the pressure that is building against that wall of institutional silence. We are now at a point where the question deserves to be looked at whole. Not just the fragments, not just the individual pieces of evidence in isolation, but the entire shape of what the evidence, assembled honestly and without institutional filter, actually suggests. It suggests this. Sometime in the period between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, a group of people with organizational capabilities and material culture, consistent with the Roman world, arrived in the region of the American Southwest that we now call the Grand Canyon. They arrived not by land, but by water, ascending the Colorado River from its mouth, in what is now the Gulf of California. They entered the canyon because the river entered it, and because the canyon offered something that explorers of any era value above almost everything else: shelter, fresh water, and a degree of natural defensibility that would have made a campsite inside it vastly safer than anything on the exposed plateau above. They explored the canyon's walls, found natural chambers elevated above the river's reach, and modified at least some of those chambers into something more deliberate: a cache, a waypoint, possibly a location of ceremony. They left objects behind, not carelessly, not by accident, but deliberately, as a marker of presence, perhaps, as a votive deposit in a place that their own religious sensibility recognized as sacred, as a cache of supplies intended for a return journey that may or may not have materialized. The objects they left were characteristic of their world: copper instruments, ceramic vessels of a Mediterranean style, tablets inscribed with writing that did not belong to any American tradition, a large figure positioned to face the east, toward the world they had come from, across the water they had crossed. They were not the first people from the Old World to have reached this continent. Before them, and possibly long before them, Phoenician sailors following the Atlantic currents had established some form of contact with the Western Hemisphere. Whether they reached the canyon itself, or whether their influence filtered inland through trade and exchange with indigenous peoples over generations, is a question that the current state of the evidence cannot definitively answer. What is clear is that the canyon walls contain inscriptions consistent with Phoenician-era script, and that no other explanation for those inscriptions, not independent invention, not coincidence, not misidentification, has been seriously proposed by the mainstream institutions that prefer the inscriptions not be discussed. The Romans who came, if they came, were inheritors of this Phoenician knowledge. They were following a route that had been, in some form, previously traced. They were applying Roman organizational precision to a journey whose general outlines had already been established. And when they arrived, they found a continent that was already populated, already cultured, already possessed of sophisticated systems of knowledge and ceremony that had been developing for thousands of years in the beautiful isolation that the great oceans provided. They encountered people who had their own names for everything they saw, their own relationship to the land, their own understanding of the sky and the water and the deep red stone of the canyon. And those people, the ones who would later preserve memory of these visitors in oral traditions that academia has chosen not to take seriously, watch the strangers arrive, attempt communication, and eventually depart, leaving behind not only their objects, but a trace in the indigenous memory that has survived every subsequent century of disruption and erasure. Now consider what the confirmation of this history would mean, not abstractly, not philosophically, but concretely and practically. It would mean that the history of human contact across the Atlantic Ocean is not a story that begins in 1492. It is a story that begins, at minimum, 2,000 years earlier. And this is not a minor chronological adjustment. It is a fundamental revision of one of the most basic structures of the story that Western civilization tells about itself. The narrative of Columbus as the great discoverer, the man who connected two hemispheres that had been sealed from each other since the first humans walked out of Africa, is not merely a historical claim. It is a founding myth. It undergirds entire frameworks of political and cultural identity. It organizes the way Americans understand their own origin story, the way European nations understand their relationship to the Americas, the way the indigenous peoples of the Americas are positioned relative to the civilizations that colonized them. If the Americas were not isolated from the Old World from the time of the first human migration until 1492, then every claim built on that isolation becomes more complicated, including claims about what indigenous peoples knew, what they had access to, and how they developed the extraordinary complexity of their civilizations in the centuries and millennia before European contact, including claims about what European powers were actually discovering versus rediscovering when they arrived in force in the late 15th century, including, in a way that is genuinely important and genuinely unresolved, claims about the relationship between indigenous American cultural achievement and the broader story of human civilizational development across the entire planet. These are not comfortable complications. They are the kind of complications that institutions, which exist to simplify and stabilize the stories societies tell about themselves, are structurally motivated to resist. And this is perhaps the most important insight that the Grand Canyon mystery offers. Not the specific claim about Roman visitors, not the specific accusation about Smithsonian suppression, but the broader pattern it reveals about how human institutions handle knowledge that is true but inconvenient. They do not, in most cases, destroy it outright. Outright destruction is too obvious, too documentable, too vulnerable to being reversed when the destroyed materials are later rediscovered. What institutions do instead is manage the context of the knowledge. They control who has access to it, how it is framed, what questions it is permitted to answer. They place it in the category of disputed or unverified or requiring further study, and then they make sure that the further study never happens, or happens in controlled conditions that guarantee the result will not challenge the consensus. This is what happened to the 1909 Kinkaid discovery. The archive was not burned, it was relocated. The records were not destroyed, they were reclassified. The site was not filled in. It was restricted. The question was not answered, it was managed. And for a century, the management held well enough that most people who heard about the Arizona Gazette article assumed it must have been a hoax, because if it were real, surely something would have come of it by now. But something did come of it. The evidence came of it. The pattern of suppression came of it. The restricted zone came of it. The anomalous subsurface signatures in the geophysical surveys came of it. The Roman coins in American soil, the Phoenician petroglyphs in the canyon walls, the missing catalogue entries in the Smithsonian's archives, the oral traditions of peoples who have lived in the canyon's shadow since before any known history, all of these came of it. They did not come in a form that is easy to compile into a courtroom argument or a peer-reviewed paper, but they came, and they are here, and they are, for the person willing to look at them without the filter of institutional permission, remarkably coherent. The archive that was deleted was not merely a collection of documents, it was a chapter of human history. A chapter in which the world's greatest empire sent people to the edge of the known world and beyond it, driven by the same impulse that has driven every great human journey ever undertaken. The need to know what is on the other side, the refusal to accept that the horizon is the end of the story, the deeply human conviction that somewhere beyond the point where the maps stop, there is something worth finding. Something worth the risk, the distance, the silence, and the eventual erasure that seems to accompany every truth, too significant to be safely public. The Grand Canyon still stands. It will stand when every institution that has managed its secrets is dust. Its walls still carry whatever was carved into them, whether by wind or by hands that crossed an ocean to reach them. Its restricted zones still guard whatever is inside them. And the question that a man named Kinkaid brought to the surface in 1909, and that a handful of stubborn, professionally bruised researchers have kept alive across the centuries since, is still waiting in the stone. Not who built the greatest empire, not who had the most powerful navy, not even who crossed the ocean first. The real question, the one the canyon has been holding in its red stone walls since before the first Roman ship felt the pull of the Atlantic current, is simpler and more important than any of those. It is the question that every deleted archive is really about. The question that every restricted zone and reclassified record and institutional silence is designed to prevent from being answered. What is true? Not what is convenient, not what is safe, not what fits the story that powerful institutions have decided to tell. What actually happened in the long and complicated and vastly underestimated history of human beings moving across the surface of this planet, driven by curiosity and courage, and the unquenchable need to see what lies beyond the next horizon? That question has not been answered. Not fully, not honestly. But it has not been destroyed either, and that is what matters most. Because a question that survives is a question that can still be answered. The archive was deleted, but deletion is not the same as destruction. Things that are deleted can be recovered. Records that are missing can sometimes be found. Chambers sealed inside a canyon wall by 2,000 years of geological time and 100 years of institutional restriction can, eventually, be opened. The Romans understood something that their successors in power have consistently tried to forget. They understood that the world is larger than any empire's map of it, that beyond every known boundary there is more, that the horizon is not a wall, but a beginning. They sailed past it. They descended into the earth to honor what they found on the other side. They left their mark in stone and copper and ceramic in the walls of a canyon that did not have a name in their language, in a world that did not exist in their geography, at the edge of everything they thought they knew. And then history, or the people who write history, looked away. But the canyon did not. It has been waiting, patient as stone, for the rest of the story to be told. It is still waiting. And now, perhaps for the first time, enough people are listening.